A man named Harlan Pruitt had spent 41 years working the floor of the Shenandoah Valley Canning Company in Rockingham County, Virginia, and he had been writing things down in a composition notebook since 1974. He died in March of 2009, 8 months before the cannery closed, and by his own telling, he did not expect it to matter much to anyone. What he had written was not a memoir, not a confession, just a record, variety names, germination notes, season lengths, yield observations from the company's trial plots. The kind of careful notations a man makes when he understands that information is a perishable thing and somebody ought to preserve it. He had worked the seed handling line long enough to know that the varieties the cannery processed in the 1970s and 1980s were not the same as the ones they processed by 2005. The new ones were designed for uniformity and shelf life in machine harvesting. They were not worse, exactly, just different. Optimized for a different purpose than the ones they replaced. He gave his notebooks and a collection of paper seed envelopes, 47 of them, mostly labeled in his own handwriting, some labeled in a hand older than his own, to a woman named Ruth Caldwell before he died. She was 34 years old and worked at the Rockingham County Cooperative Extension Office. He told her he didn't know what she'd do with them, and she told him she wasn't sure either. That honest answer was apparently what he had been hoping for, because he handed them over the same afternoon. 11 years later, in the second Saturday of June 2020, Ruth Caldwell stood behind a 6-foot folding table at the Harrisonburg Farmers Market and sold out of every tomato she had brought by 9:40 in the morning. She had brought 214 pounds across 11 varieties. The last customer of the morning, a chef from a restaurant on Court Square who had been buying from her for 2 seasons, bought out her remaining German Johnson stock, 9 pounds, at $5. 50 a pound, and asked her to hold an order for the following week. She told him she'd see what she had. She drove home with an empty cooler and $847 in a cash envelope and sat in the driveway for a minute before she went inside. Most people who watch stories like this scroll past without subscribing. But if you've ever been underestimated, talked over, or dismissed because of what you were carrying rather than what it was worth, stay with us. This one is for you. Ruth Caldwell had not started a business in 2009 when Harlan Pruitt handed her the notebooks. She had started a garden. That distinction mattered for the first several years, and then it mattered less, and then it stopped mattering altogether, but in 2009 it was accurate and important. She was a cooperative extension agent. She understood seeds in the way her training had prepared her to understand them. Germination rates, soil temperature requirements, disease resistance profiles, days to maturity figures that corresponded to the varieties in the university's current trial lists. What she did not understand, at first, was what Harlan had actually given her. The paper envelopes in the collection ranged in age from recent to very old. Some of the oldest ones had been resealed with strips of masking tape that had gone brown and brittle. The variety names written on them were mostly unfamiliar to her, not because she lacked knowledge, but because some of these varieties had not appeared in any university extension guide she could find, for the simple reason that they predated the guides. Brandywine she knew. German Johnson she knew. Mortgage lifters she knew. Barely, but there were 12 varieties in the collection, whose names she could not locate in any seed catalog or extension database she checked in the first 6 months. One of them was labeled Shenandoah Oxheart in a handwriting that was not Harlan's, in pencil that had faded to a color almost indistinguishable from the envelope. Another was labeled Pruitt's Yellow in Harlan's own hand, with a date, September 1983, below it. She planted everything the first spring, not with any commercial intention, just to see what came up. What came up changed the direction of the next 12 years of her life. though she would not have said so at the time. Ruth grew up in the southern end of Rockingham County, in a house her grandmother had kept until the early 1990s and that still smelled, when she was a child, of the canning her grandmother did every August. A specific smell she could not describe exactly, but that involved tomatoes and vinegar and the particular sweetness of fruit that has been reduced by heat for a long time. It was not the smell of a store. It was the smell of a kitchen that had been doing the same work for 40 years and had absorbed it into the walls. Her grandmother had kept a kitchen garden that ran along the south side of the house for the simple reason that the south side had the best light, and her grandmother was not a person who made decisions carelessly. The garden produced most of what the household put up each year: tomatoes, pole beans, sweet corn, winter squash, dried peppers, pickled okra from 3 plants that grew up a section of wire fence along the east end. It was not a decorative garden. It was a working one, and every inch of it was accountable. Ruth had worked in it from the time she could be trusted with a trowel, which was earlier, she suspected, than most adults would have permitted. But her grandmother had a practical streak that ran deeper than caution. She had not been a sentimental woman. She had not made speeches about the garden or the seeds or the importance of any of it. She had just worked in it, and let Ruth work in it beside her, and answered questions when they were asked, and didn't volunteer more than that. What she passed to Ruth, she passed without ceremony. The way you pass a tool to someone standing next to you, you just hand it over and get back to the work. Ruth had learned without knowing she was learning. That was the only way her grandmother operated. Her grandmother had saved seed every fall, not in labeled envelopes, not organized by variety or date in any formal way, just in the small waxy bags that the pharmacy in Bridgewater used for prescriptions. Because those bags were uniform and resealable and free when you asked at the counter. And her grandmother did not spend money on something she could get for free. She wrote the variety name on the outside in ballpoint pen, sometimes the year, sometimes not, and she stored them in a coffee can on the second shelf of the pantry between the baking powder and the cornmeal. The can was an old Folgers can with a plastic lid. Ruth could still picture it exactly. Ruth's grandmother had died in the spring of 2001. The coffee can had gone with everything else to a cousin in Harrisonburg who had thanked the family, packed up what she could use, and eventually, Ruth had come to understand years later, thrown away the things she couldn't identify or didn't have room for. The seeds were among those things. Ruth had not been present for any of it. She had been 26 years old and living in Charlottesville and not yet thinking in any serious way about the things she would later wish she had thought about sooner. There was no moment of loss she could point to. She had not known what was in the can. She had not asked. By the time she might have, it was already gone. She could not have said, looking back, exactly when the shift happened, when she started understanding that the things being lost were not going to be replaced, and that waiting to care about them was itself a kind of decision. She could not have pinpointed the morning it changed. She just knew that by the time Harlan Pruitt sat down across from her in the extension office in the fall of 2008, his hands on the notebooks, and told her what he had written and why he'd written it, and that he didn't know what to do with any of it now that he was sick, she was already the kind of person who would say yes. She had been becoming that person for 7 years without quite knowing it. She planted 43 of the 47 varieties in the spring of 2010. The other 4 had germination rates so low, she tested them in damp paper towels on the kitchen counter in February, the way the extension guides describe for old seed, that she decided to hold them back another season rather than risk the entire supply on a germination rate she didn't trust. Of the 43 she planted out, 38 germinated in the seed trays. 34 made it to transplant. She grew them in raised beds at her rental house on Kratzer Road, and in a 40-foot plot she borrowed from a neighbor named Jim Showalter, who had more garden space than he had time to use, and was glad to have someone putting it to work. She transplanted on the second weekend of May, staked everything with bamboo and jute twine, and kept a dedicated spiral notebook for the season. She recorded everything from emergence to first fruit to end-of-season seed harvest. Days to transplant ready seedlings. Transplant survival rate. Canopy spread at mid-season. Days from transplant to first color. Color notes, because the old varieties came in colors that the modern catalogs did not quite have names for, a deep mottled crimson green on the mortgage lifter's shoulders that shifted as the fruit ripened. A yellow so pale on one unlabeled variety that she called it cream rather than yellow in her notes, because yellow suggested something brighter. Flavor she recorded in plain language: acidic, balanced, sweet-forward, meaty, watery, complex. She ate every variety raw off the vine, and also cooked them down to note whether the flavor held through heat. Because canning was what the cannery had grown these varieties for, and she wanted to know whether that quality was still in the seed. Tendency to crack in wet conditions, skin thickness relative to flesh. Shelf life at room temperature after harvest, which she measured in days and which varied from 3 to 11 across the varieties she tested. She was aware, doing this, that she was doing what Harlan had done, and doing what her grandmother had done in the way her grandmother had done everything, without announcing it, without particular ceremony, just attending to what was in front of her and writing it down. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the entire thing. By the third season, she had identified 9 varieties that she considered exceptional, not by any standard a university would have published, but by a composite of flavor, appearance, productivity, and what she privately called holdability, meaning the ability of a picked tomato to remain worth eating for longer than 48 hours without refrigeration. This was the quality the cannery had originally selected for, she had come to understand. Varieties grown for processing had to arrive at the plant at peak ripeness and still be sound. Fruit that bruised in transit or deteriorated inside 48 hours of harvest was useless to a canning operation. So the old commercial varieties had been selection grown, over decades, to be dense-fleshed and firm-skinned at peak flavor, and what Harlan's seed collection had preserved was not just the variety, but the accumulated result of 40 or 50 years of those selections. Seed saved each year from the best-performing plants, which had, without anyone designing it this way, produced a strain of tomato that was genuinely different from both the modern grocery variety and from the original heirloom type. Commercial tomatoes developed since the 1980s were engineered for a longer shelf life and a tougher skin achieved through different means. Varieties with thicker cell walls, higher pectin content, lower water weight. They stayed firm longer. They shipped better. They did not, as a general rule, taste the same as what came before, and the people who had grown up eating what came before knew it, even if they could not have explained the chemistry of the difference. A German Johnson tomato from Harlan's seed stock, grown in Virginia soil and selection saved for 4 decades in the Shenandoah Valley, did not look like a grocery store tomato. It was ribbed and irregular, and it bruised if you pressed it without care, and it had a shelf life at room temperature of about 5 days before it started to go soft at the shoulders. It was also, to anyone who had eaten a tomato before 1985 and could still remember what that was like, startlingly close to that memory. She gave some to an elderly neighbor on Kratzer Road in the second summer. The neighbor ate one standing over the kitchen sink and then said nothing for a moment, and then said quietly that she had not tasted one like that since her mother's garden. Ruth wrote that down too. A man named Dennis Alcott had been retiring from the Virginia Cooperative Extension Service in Shenandoah County for what felt, to his colleagues, like several years before he actually did it in the summer of 2015. He was 64. He had spent 37 years advising small farms and market gardeners across the northern Shenandoah Valley, and he had a practiced eye for what people were growing and a less practiced ability to keep himself from commenting on it. He came to the Harrisonburg Farmers Market on a Saturday in August of 2013 because his wife had asked him to pick up sweet corn, and he had ended up standing in front of Ruth's table for longer than the corn warranted, reading the handwritten variety cards she had made for each tomato. He asked her where the Shenandoah Oxheart stock had come from. She told him about Harlan Pruitt and the notebooks. Dennis Alcott was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had heard of that variety, that it had been grown commercially in the northern part of the valley at least into the late 1960s, and that he had believed it to be gone. He had not said this to be flattering. He said it the way a man says something when new information has just rearranged something he thought he had settled. He bought 4 pounds of the Oxheart and the German Johnson, and a heirloom yellow pear variety that Ruth had provisionally named Pruitt's Yellow, consistent with Harlan's label. He came back the following Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. By October, he had introduced Ruth to 3 restaurant accounts in the Harrisonburg area who were, he said, exactly the kind of buyer she needed, specific, knowledgeable, and willing to pay for something they could not source anywhere else. That was the year the garden became a business. Not officially, not with paperwork and accounts, but in the sense that it stopped being optional. By 2017, Ruth was farming a leased 2.5-acre plot outside Dayton, Virginia, in addition to the original raised beds, and growing 15 varieties of open-pollinated tomatoes, plus smaller quantities of heirloom peppers and winter squash from seed stock in the collection. She had worked with a seed conservation organization to formally document 6 of the 12 unidentified varieties from Harlan's envelopes, including the Shenandoah Oxheart, which was confirmed by cross-reference with historical agricultural records to have been grown commercially in Rockingham County as early as 1931. She had sent verified seed samples to 2 University Extension seed libraries and to the Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa, where the Oxheart was now listed in the yearbook under the name Harlan had never given it. The catalogers had named it after the valley, not the man, and Ruth had not objected, though she thought privately that Pruitt's Oxheart would have been more accurate. She did not say that to anyone except Dennis Alcott, who agreed and said the cataloging people had their own way of doing things, and there wasn't much point in arguing it. The business crossed 6 figures in gross revenue for the first time in the 2019 season, $108,400 in sales across the farmers market, 4 restaurant accounts, a small CSA she had launched in 2018 with 31 members, and a seedling operation that she ran each spring, selling started plants of the documented heritage varieties to home gardeners and a handful of small farms that wanted to grow them out. The seedling sales alone had brought in $14,200 that year, which Ruth had not predicted, and which changed how she thought about the scale of what she was doing. She hired 1 part-time employee in 2020, a young woman from Bridgewater College who was studying sustainable agriculture. She told her, the first day, that the most important thing on the farm was the seed, not the tomatoes. The seed. The tomatoes were what they sold. The seed was what they kept. She has 214 pounds of produce in the cooler on a good Saturday morning at the Harrisonburg market now. And she sells out by mid-morning most weeks. And the chef on Court Square has her number and texts ahead to hold the German Johnson and whatever she has of the Shenandoah Oxheart, because he moves them by the plate in season, and his customers ask about them by name, which is a thing that did not happen with tomatoes 10 years ago and is happening now. She has copies of Harlan Pruitt's composition notebooks, scanned and printed, kept in a 3-ring binder in the farm office, And the originals are in an archival acid-free box in a climate-controlled closet in her house. Because paper is fragile, and time is patient, and she has learned not to take either of them for granted. She talks to seed conservation people now the way she used to talk to extension agents, regularly, about specific problems, with notes taken on both sides of the call. Dennis Alcott drove by the leased farm outside Dayton on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2022, just to see how the season was starting. He did not stop. He just slowed down along the road long enough to see the transplant trays lined up in the low tunnel houses along the south edge of the field. Hundreds of them, all the same pale green, holding seedlings that in 4 months would be carrying tomatoes that had not been grown commercially in this valley for 50 years or more. He said later that he didn't know why he didn't stop. He just felt like it wasn't the moment for it. The farm was busy. Ruth was in the field. Some things you don't need to interrupt. He drove on. The seedlings stayed where they were, doing what they had always done, which was grow. Harlan Pruitt would have been 82 years old in 2023. He had not expected the notebooks to matter to anyone. He had given them away because they existed and because throwing them away had seemed wrong. He was not a man who attached sentiment to his own judgment. He was just a man who wrote things down and, at the end, made sure the writing went somewhere that wasn't the trash. He had been right, without knowing it, about more than he would have admitted to. The oldest envelope in the collection does not have a name on it. Just a date, August 1949, in a handwriting that is not Harlan's and not anyone's that Ruth has been able to identify. She has not planted those seeds. She is waiting until she has enough of everything else to justify the risk of germination failure on something she cannot replace. There are 42 seeds in the envelope. She counted them in 2011 and has counted them twice since. She keeps the envelope in the same archival box as the notebooks. She knows what it is. She is not ready for it yet, and she is patient enough to know the difference. Some things you hold until you're sure you know what you have. And some things were held for you by someone who never got to see them opened.